The candles in the great hall of Thornfield burned low and gold against the limestone walls, and Margaret Elwood stood at the foot of the staircase in the gown she had worn 3 days earlier to her own wedding. It was the best she owned. The silk had been her mother's, taken apart and resewn by Margaret's own hand in the week before the ceremony, and the stitching at the waist still pulled when she breathed. She breathed carefully now. The household had gathered to receive her. 14 servants stood in a line that curved from the hall's oak doors to the cold hearth at the far end, and not one of them looked at her directly. Their eyes moved past her shoulder, over her head, through her, the way a gaze slides past a chair placed in the wrong room. At the head of the line stood the Dowager Duchess of Thornfield, Lady Ashworth, a woman of 60 whose posture communicated that she had never in her life been required to stand for someone she did not choose to receive. "So," Lady Ashworth said. The single word filled the hall the way a stone fills a well. Margaret curtsied. It was correct. She had practiced it in the coaching inn at Chipping Norton while her new husband settled accounts with the innkeeper, and it had been correct then, too. The Dowager did not acknowledge it. "You are smaller than I expected," Lady Ashworth said, "and plainer." The line of servants did not move. No face changed. The hall's limestone held the cold the way old stone does, and Margaret felt it climb from the flagstones through her thin-soled shoes and settle in her knees. She kept her hands folded at her waist, the left thumb pressing against the right. A habit her father had never noticed, and her mother had noticed every time. Then the Duke walked in. James Ashworth, 7th Duke of Thornfield, entered from the east corridor with the stride of a man who owned every wall he passed between. He was tall, dark-haired, 31 years old, and his face carried the particular stillness of someone who had learned very young that his expressions would be read by rooms. He did not smile. He had not smiled at the wedding either, and Margaret had already stopped expecting it. He crossed to where she stood, and for one held breath he looked at her. Not past her, not through her. At her. His eyes moved from her face to the pulled stitching at her waist, to her thin shoes on the cold stone, to the small leather-bound book she carried pressed against her ribs beneath one arm. A book of watercolors her mother had painted in the garden at Leighton, before the debts ate it. Before the garden was sold along with everything else. Margaret held it the way some women hold prayer books. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said, his voice low, "your room has been prepared." That was all. He turned to the housekeeper, Mrs. Pruitt, and spoke a quiet instruction Margaret could not hear, and Margaret was led upstairs by a woman whose kindness she would not recognize for another week, because kindness at Thornfield wore the same expression as indifference, and she had not yet learned to tell the difference. If you have ever walked into a house that did not want you, you already know the shape of what is coming, and you know that the house was rarely the thing that changed its mind. She did not look back at the Duke as she climbed the stairs. She did not see that he watched her go, or that his hand moved once to the breast pocket of his coat, and stopped there, pressing something flat and small beneath the wool. He held it for 3 seconds. Then he let it go, turned on his heel, and walked back the way he had come, his face as still as it had been when he entered. What Margaret did not yet know was that the thing in his pocket was a miniature painted on ivory, and that the woman in the miniature had been dead for 4 years, and that the Duke of Thornfield had married Margaret Elwood not only because her father owed £3,000 to men who would see him rot in a debtor's cell for it. He had married her for a reason he had not yet said aloud to anyone, least of all to himself. The debts were real enough. Edward Elwood, Margaret's father, had been a gentleman of modest means and immodest trust. He had signed a promissory note for a friend named Phelps, who had subsequently died, and the creditors had turned to Mr. Elwood for the full sum. £3,000. It was the sort of figure that a duke would not notice missing from his quarterly accounts, and that a country gentleman's daughter would sell her entire life to cover. Margaret had sold hers on a Tuesday morning in Bath, in a church whose rector she had never met, wearing her mother's silk and holding the watercolor book against her side like a talisman. The arrangement had been delivered to her by Mr. Harding, the Duke's solicitor, who had arrived at the Elwood cottage in Leighton on a grey afternoon in April, with a leather case, and an offer written in language so precise it left no room for hope. The Duke of Thornfield would settle Mr. Elwood's debts in full. In return, Miss Elwood would consent to be his wife. There would be no courtship. There would be a settlement ensuring her maintenance. The ceremony would take place within the fortnight. Margaret had read the document twice, asked one question, and signed. "Does he know what I look like?" she had asked Mr. Harding. Mr. Harding had paused. "His Grace has been informed of the relevant particulars, Miss Elwood." She had not asked what the relevant particulars were. She suspected they did not include her face. Her father had wept when she told him. He had sat in the chair by the window where her mother used to read, and pressed his hands over his eyes, and wept like a man who understood that his daughter was paying a price he had been too careless to prevent. Margaret had knelt beside him and held his wrists and said nothing, because the thing she wanted to say was that she was frightened, and that would have made his weeping worse. At Thornfield, she learned the house quickly. It was vast. Built in the last century by a duke who believed that grandeur was a form of argument, and its rooms unfolded from the central hall like the chambers of a nautilus. Margaret walked them in the early mornings before the household stirred, learning which floorboards announced her and which kept her secret. She learned that the library smelled of beeswax and old paper. She learned that the East Garden had been let go to seed, and that no one had touched it since the previous duchess had died. She learned that the servants called her nothing at all, which was worse than calling her something cruel, because it meant she had not yet earned a name in the house's private language. It was Lady Ashworth who gave her one. On the fourth evening, Margaret passed the morning room on her way to the library and heard the dowager's voice through the half-open door. Miss Caroline Langley was seated across from her, a woman Margaret's own age, whose beauty had the polished confidence of someone who had been told since girlhood that she was the correct choice for something important. "She is a transaction," the dowager said. "A debt settled in lace. The debt bride, Caroline. That is all she is, and that is all she will remain." Miss Langley's teacup touched the saucer without a sound. "And His Grace?" "His Grace will come to his senses," the dowager said. "He always does. This is a spell of guilt, nothing more. When it passes, you will still be here." Margaret's fingers tightened on the watercolor book. She walked on without stopping. And her shoes made no sound on the carpet, and the morning room door stayed open behind her like a mouth that had said what it meant to say. The debt bride. She carried the phrase upstairs the way she had carried her father's debts, which was to say, quietly, and without allowing it to change the angle of her chin. The days at Thornfield settled into a pattern Margaret recognized from service, though she had never been a servant. She rose early. She breakfasted alone, because the Duke took his meals in the study, and the dowager did not acknowledge her presence at the table. She walked the grounds when the weather permitted, and the library when it did not. She mended her own clothes, which the dowager's maid observed with visible distaste. She wrote to her father every second day, letters that described the gardens and the weather, and did not mention the dowager or the cold, or the fact that her husband had spoken to her exactly 9 times since the wedding, and each time in sentences that did not exceed 6 words. "Good morning, Mrs. Ashworth." Dinner is at 8. Is the room satisfactory? Good night. He was not unkind. That was the bewildering thing. He was simply absent, a man who had performed a transaction and then retreated behind walls she could see the outline of, without understanding what they were made of. He moved through Thornfield with the careful discipline of someone managing a wound he had decided not to name, and Margaret, who had spent her life reading the silences of people who would not say what they meant, read his silence and found it full. On the 9th morning, she found him in the East Garden. She had gone there because it was the one place at Thornfield where no one went. The beds were overgrown, the paths lost under creeping thyme and self-seeded foxglove, and a stone bench at the far wall sat beneath a climbing rose that had not been trained in years. Margaret had begun, without asking permission, to clear the nearest bed. She worked in an old pair of gloves she had brought from Leighton, kneeling in the damp earth, pulling bindweed from the roots of something she thought might be lavender. She did not hear him approach. "You will ruin that gown," the Duke said from behind her. Margaret's hand stilled in the soil. She did not turn. "It has been ruined before, Your Grace." A silence. She could feel him standing there the way one feels a change in the weather, a shift in the pressure of the air against the back of one's neck. "Come inside," he said. "It is too cold for that." "I am not cold." "Mrs. Ashworth." His voice carried the quality she was beginning to recognize, a low command that was syntactically in order and functionally something else entirely. "Come inside." She stood. She turned. He was closer than she had expected, 3 steps rather than the 10 she had imagined, and the nearness of him sent a warmth through her face that had nothing to do with the April air. His eyes dropped to her hands, which were dark with soil, and to the watercolor book she had left on the stone bench, its cover spotted with rain she had not noticed falling. He crossed to the bench in 2 strides, picked up the book, and held it out to her. "You should not leave this in the wet," he said. "It is only a book, Your Grace." "It is not only a book." He said it without raising his voice, and the certainty in the words stopped her. He had noticed it. He had noticed her carrying it at the wedding, in the hall, at breakfast, to the library, and now here. He had catalogued its presence the way he catalogued everything, in silence, without appearing to look. Margaret took the book from his hands. Their fingers did not touch, and yet the almost touching was its own event. A held half-second in which the air between his hand and hers carried a charge she could not name, and he would not acknowledge. "Eat something before you come back out here," he said. Then he turned and walked toward the house, and Margaret stood in the ruined garden with soil on her knees and her mother's watercolors pressed against her chest, and her heart doing something she had not given it permission to do. 2 weeks into the marriage, Miss Langley was invited to stay at Thornfield for the season. The Dowager arranged it with the serene confidence of a woman rearranging furniture in her own house, which, in her estimation, she was. Miss Langley arrived with 3 trunks, a lady's maid, and the quiet radiance of someone who had been groomed since birth for the exact position Margaret now occupied. Margaret watched from the upstairs window as Miss Langley descended from the carriage, and she noted the way the Dowager crossed the gravel to greet her, the embrace, the arm linked through arm, the laugh that carried across the courtyard like a bell. No one had laughed when Margaret arrived. That evening, a dinner was held. 8 guests from the neighboring estates. Margaret was seated at the far end of the table, between the vicar's wife and a retired colonel who spoke at length about drainage. The Duke sat at the head. Miss Langley was placed at his right. It was during the 2nd course that Lady Ashworth turned to Mrs. Pemberton, the wife of the local magistrate, and said in a voice pitched exactly loud enough to carry to Margaret's end of the table, We must be patient with her, of course. A debt bride cannot be expected to know the customs of the house." Mrs. Pemberton's fork paused above her plate. Her eyes flicked to Margaret, and away again. And in that small motion, Margaret read the entire table's assessment of her, confirmed, and filed away. The debt bride. The phrase landed differently in public than it had in the morning room. In private, it had been a verdict between two women who believed they knew the future. In public, it was a brand. Margaret did not look up from her plate. Her left thumb pressed against her right wrist beneath the table's edge, and she counted her breaths, and she continued eating. And she did not permit the heat behind her eyes to become anything the table could see. What she did not see was the Duke's response. His jaw tightened. His hand, which had been reaching for his glass, stopped midway and returned to the table's surface. He looked at his mother for a long moment, with an expression Margaret would have recognized if she had been watching, because it was the same expression she wore when someone said something about her father's debts that she was not going to dignify with a reply. Controlled fury. Quiet and absolute. He said nothing. He returned to his meal. And the dinner continued as if nothing had been spoken. The next morning, Margaret woke to find a pair of new gardening gloves outside her door, lined with lamb's wool, sized to her hands. There was no note. The witnessing happened on a Thursday, though Margaret did not know she was being witnessed, and the Duke did not intend to watch. Mrs. Pruitt's youngest girl, a child of 7 named Alice, had taken a fever, and the physician from the village was occupied with a difficult birth at one of the tenant farms. Margaret learned this from a kitchen maid whose face was tight with worry, and she went to Mrs. Pruitt's quarters without asking anyone's permission and sat beside the child for 4 hours, pressing cool cloths to her forehead, reading aloud from a book of fairy tales she found on the shelf, and singing once, very quietly, a song her own mother had sung to her when she was small and frightened, and the world was too large. The Duke had come to speak with Mrs. Pruitt about a matter concerning the household accounts. He arrived at the door of the housekeeper's sitting room and stopped. Margaret was kneeling beside the child's cot with one hand on the girl's damp hair, and she was telling Alice that the fever was a dragon, and that Alice was the sort of girl who frightened dragons simply by refusing to be frightened of them. And Alice was laughing weakly, and the sound of that laugh in the small, warm room was the first genuinely happy sound Margaret had made since arriving at Thornfield. The Duke stood in the doorway for 11 seconds. Margaret did not look up. Alice did not notice him. Mrs. Pruitt, who had been standing at the window wringing a cloth, saw him and opened her mouth to speak, and he raised one hand, a single small gesture that meant, "Do not announce me," and Mrs. Pruitt closed her mouth and looked away, and the Duke watched Margaret Elwood tend a child who was not hers in a house that was not yet hers, with a gentleness that cost her nothing because it was not performed. It was simply what she was. He left without speaking. Margaret did not know he had been there. Alice's fever broke that night, and the following morning Mrs. Pruitt brought Margaret a cup of tea with a slice of cake on the saucer, and called her Your Grace for the first time, and Margaret almost wept at the kindness of it. Something shifted after that. Though Margaret could not have named what it was, the Duke began to appear in rooms where she happened to be. The library at mid-morning, the garden at dusk, the breakfast room at an hour when he had never previously breakfasted. He did not explain his presence. He did not make conversation beyond the spare exchanges she had grown accustomed to. He simply occupied the same air, and Margaret's body registered his proximity with a faithfulness her mind refused to permit. The warmth in her face when he entered. The way her hand steadied itself against the back of a chair when he passed close. The awareness of exactly where he stood in a room without turning to check, as if some instrument inside her had been calibrated to his position and could not be switched off. "Sit down," he said one evening when she was standing by the fire, mending a torn hem. "The light is better at the desk. I can see well enough, Your Grace." "Margaret." He said it without preamble, and the sound of her given name in his voice stopped the needle in her hand. He had never used it before. "Sit down." She sat. She did not look at him. Her pulse was visible in her throat, and she pressed one hand flat against the fabric in her lap to keep it from trembling. And she thought, "This is what it is to be known by someone who does not yet know he is knowing you." If this story were only about a debt repaid, it would end here, with the gloves and the garden and the quiet accumulation of his attention. It is not only about a debt repaid. Near the end of the 3rd week, Margaret found the miniature. She had not gone looking for it. She had gone to the Duke's study to return a book she had borrowed from the library, and the study door was open, and on the desk, beside a stack of correspondence, lay a small ivory oval in a tarnished silver frame. The woman in the painting was young, fair-haired, and smiling with the uncomplicated confidence of someone who had never doubted that she was loved. Her name, Margaret had learned from Mrs. Pruitt, was Eleanor Ashworth, the 6th Duchess of Thornfield by marriage, had died 4 years ago in the autumn of the year, in this house, in the room that was now Margaret's room. She had died in childbirth. The child had not survived either. And the Duke had locked the east garden, which Eleanor had planted, and he had stopped smiling, and he had worn the miniature in his breast pocket every day since, and he had married Margaret Elwood not in spite of his grief over Eleanor, but because of something the grief had taught him. Margaret did not touch the miniature. She set the book on the desk and turned to leave, and the Duke was standing in the doorway. His eyes went from her face to the miniature on the desk. His jaw set. His hand moved to the doorframe, and his knuckles whitened there. "I was returning a book," Margaret said quietly. "I did not mean to intrude." A silence expanded between them, and in it Margaret heard the thing he had been carrying since before the wedding, the weight that made his stillness not coldness but compression, the silence of a man holding something down because he feared what would happen if he let it rise. "Her name was Eleanor," he said. His voice was level. "She died because I was not here. I was in London on business that did not require my presence, and she sent word that the child was coming early, and I did not arrive in time. The physician said it would not have mattered. I have never believed him." Margaret did not move. She did not offer comfort, because she understood, in the way that one wounded person understands another, that comfort offered too quickly becomes another wall to hold up. "She was kind," the Duke said, "as you are kind. She went to the tenants when they were ill. She sang to the housekeeper's children. She sat in that garden for hours with her sketching pencils and drew things I could not see the value of until she showed me." He stopped. His hand was still on the doorframe, and his face was still as carved stone, and Margaret saw for the first time the cost of his composure, and understood that it was not reserve. It was grief wearing the only shape he knew how to give it. "I am sorry," Margaret said. "She must have been very loved." "She was." 2 words. He said them the way one sets down something heavy. Then he crossed the room, picked up the miniature, and placed it in the top drawer of the desk, face down. It was the first time Mrs. Pruitt would later tell Margaret that he had put it away since Eleanor's death. The season's assembly at Thornfield was Lady Ashworth's annual declaration of authority, a ball held in the Great Hall each May, to which every family of consequence within 20 miles was invited. It was the dowager's stage, and she had performed upon it for 40 years, and she had no intention of sharing it with the woman she had decided was an aberration in the Ashworth line. Margaret dressed carefully. She wore the same silk gown, newly pressed, because it was still the best she owned, and because she had decided, somewhere in the 3 weeks of silence and soil and the Duke's careful proximity, that she would not pretend to be someone the house wanted. She would be the person she was, and let Thornfield decide. The great hall was lit with 300 candles. The guests arrived in coaches that lined the gravel drive, and Margaret stood in the receiving line beside the dowager and received their assessments with the same stillness she had brought to the hall on her first evening. Some faces were kind. Most were curious. A few were openly pitying, which was worse than cruelty because pity assumed an ending. Miss Langley stood beside the dowager in a gown of ivory satin that caught the candlelight like a sail, and Margaret noted, without resentment, that the woman was genuinely beautiful, and that the beauty served a purpose in this room that Margaret's plain face and mended silk could not match. It was near the middle of the evening that the thing happened. Lady Ashworth had gathered a circle of the senior families near the fireplace, and Margaret, crossing the room to speak with Mrs. Pruitt about a servant who had taken ill, passed close enough to hear Mrs. Pemberton say to Mrs. Graves, the Colonel's wife, "Lady Ashworth calls her the debt bride, you know, and one can see why. The poor creature has not a penny, nor a connection to recommend her. One wonders what His Grace was thinking." Mrs. Graves glanced at Margaret with the practiced indifference of a woman who had decided which side of a room held the future. Perhaps he was not thinking at all. Margaret stopped walking. She stood very still in the middle of the candlelit hall, and the watercolor book was not with her because she had left it upstairs, and she had nothing to press against her ribs. And the heat behind her eyes was very close to the surface now, and she could feel the room watching the way rooms watch when they sense that someone is about to be smaller than they already are. Lady Ashworth turned. Her face carried the satisfied composure of a woman whose verdict had been delivered and accepted by the room. "My dear girl," the dowager said, and her voice was polished and gentle and absolutely lethal. "You look tired. Perhaps you should retire. The evening is really not suited to everyone." Margaret lifted her chin. She looked at the dowager and at Mrs. Pemberton, and at the circle of faces that had agreed, over canapes and champagne, that she was a transaction and nothing more. "I am not tired, Lady Ashworth," Margaret said. Her voice was quiet and level and carried farther than she intended, and several heads turned. "I am the Duchess of Thornfield. I will stay." The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room the way water fills a glass, from the bottom up, displacing everything else. Lady Ashworth's smile did not waver, and yet something behind it shifted, a recalculation so small that only someone watching very carefully would have seen it. Margaret saw it. She held the dowager's gaze for 3 full seconds, and then she turned and continued across the room to Mrs. Pruitt, and her hands were trembling at her sides, and she did not let them stop her. The Duke was not in the hall. He had excused himself to the study an hour earlier to attend to a letter that required his signature, and Margaret had noted his absence the way one notes a missing wall in a building that needs all of its walls. She had stood alone, and she had spoken alone, and she did not know whether he would have stood with her if he had been present, and that not knowing was the wound's sharpest edge. She found the garden door at the far end of the hall, and slipped through it into the cold May night, and she sat on the stone bench beneath the untrained rose, and she pressed her hands against her face, and she allowed herself, for exactly 1 minute, to be the woman who had married a stranger to save her father, and who had received, in return, nothing she could name. What she did not know was that Mrs. Pruitt had found the Duke in his study and told him what had happened. She did not know that he had set down his pen and stood so quickly that the chair scraped the floor behind him. She did not know that he had walked through the east corridor and into the great hall, and that his face, as he entered, carried an expression the household had not seen in 4 years. He walked into the hall, and the room went quiet. Lady Ashworth was still standing by the fireplace. Miss Langley was beside her. The circle of senior families was intact, glasses in hand, conversations arrested mid-sentence by the quality of the Duke's stride, which was not the measured walk of a man attending his own ball. It was the walk of a man who had made a decision and intended the room to witness it. He crossed the hall in 4 strides. He passed his mother. He passed Miss Langley, whose face went very still. He stopped in the center of the room, and every candle in the hall seemed to lean toward him, and the conversations nearest him died first, and then the ones farther out, and then the room was silent. "Margaret is my wife," he said, his voice low and level, and carrying the way a stone carries across water. That is the end of this discussion. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at his mother. He stood in the center of the hall, where 300 candles burned, and the sentence landed in the silence the way a seal lands on wax, final and beyond appeal. Lady Ashworth's hand tightened on her glass. The color left her face in a slow tide, and for the first time since Margaret had arrived at Thornfield, the dowager's composure did not hold. Her lips parted. No sound came. Miss Langley's eyes dropped to the floor. "Where is she?" the Duke said. Mrs. Pruitt stepped forward. "The garden, Your Grace." He turned and walked toward the garden door, and the room watched him go. And in the watching, something shifted in the hall's collective assessment, the way a flock of birds turns together in the air, not because any single bird has decided to turn, yet because the wind has changed and they all feel it at once. Lady Ashworth set her glass down on the mantel. Her hand was not quite steady. Mrs. Pemberton studied the floor. Mrs. Graves cleared her throat and said nothing. Miss Langley looked at the dowager, and something in her face, something that might have been recognition and might have been grief for a future she had been promised, and now understood she would never hold, settled into quiet resignation. She stepped away from the fireplace. She did not speak. The Duke found Margaret on the stone bench in the dark garden. She was sitting with her hands in her lap and her face turned towards the climbing rose, and she did not look at him when he approached, because she had heard his step on the gravel, and she did not trust her own composure. He sat beside her. The bench was narrow. His shoulder was close enough to hers that she could feel the warmth of him through the wool of his coat, and the closeness was its own declaration, more fluent than any speech. "I heard what she said," he told her. "I should have been in the room. It does not matter." "It matters." He said it with the same quiet certainty he had used about the watercolor book. "It is not only a book, it matters." As if the world kept trying to diminish things, and he kept, in his spare and level way, insisting on their size. "Margaret." He said her name again, and again the sound of it changed the air. "I told your father's solicitor that I married you to settle a debt. I told my mother the same. I told myself the same, because the truth of it was something I was not prepared to say." She looked at him. His face was turned toward the garden, and the moonlight caught the line of his jaw, and he was not wearing his coat of composure now. He was wearing something rawer and more honest, and Margaret's breath stopped in her chest at the sight of it. "Eleanor died, and I closed every room she had touched, and I carried her picture against my heart for 4 years. And I believed that the grief was what I deserved for having failed her. Then Mr. Harding brought me your father's case. And in the papers, there was a letter you had written to the creditors asking for more time, and in that letter you described your father as a man whose only fault was trusting too easily, and you offered to work as a governess to pay the sum yourself if they would withdraw the threat of prison. You did not beg. You did not plead. You stated your terms and your willingness and your refusal to be ashamed. He paused. His hand was resting on the bench between them, close enough to hers that she could feel the heat of it, without touching. I read that letter, and I understood that I had been carrying Eleanor's death as punishment when I should have been carrying it as instruction. She would have wanted me to live. She would have wanted me to find someone whose courage was not performed. I married you to save your father, Margaret. That is the truth. And it is also true that I married you to save myself. Margaret's eyes filled. She did not look away. She did not press her thumb against her wrist, or count her breaths, or perform any of the small rituals she had used to keep herself steady in this house. She let the tears come, and they came quietly. And the Duke, who had not reached for anyone in 4 years, lifted his hand from the bench and placed it over hers, and the warmth of his palm against her cold fingers was the first uncomplicated kindness Thornfield had offered her. "I should have said it sooner," he said. "You have said it now." They sat in the garden that Eleanor had planted, beneath a rose that Margaret was already beginning to train, and the music from the great hall carried faintly through the closed door, and the May air smelled of the lavender Margaret had uncovered in the bed by the wall. His hand stayed over hers. She did not pull away. Later, much later, they returned to the house together. The hall had thinned. Lady Ashworth had retired to her rooms, and the servants were clearing the last of the glasses, and Mrs. Pruitt was standing by the door with the expression of a woman who has waited a long time for a door to open and has finally heard the handle turn. Margaret climbed the stairs to the room that had once been Eleanor's, and she sat in the chair by the window, and she opened the watercolor book her mother had painted in the garden at Leighton. She turned to the last page, where her mother had painted a small sprig of lavender in a glass jar on a windowsill, the light falling across it in the particular gold of a late afternoon in summer. Her mother had written beneath it, in a hand so like Margaret's own that the resemblance caught in her throat every time, the single word, home. Margaret looked up from the page. Through the window, the east garden was silver with moonlight, and the lavender she had uncovered was a dark mass against the pale stone wall. And Thornfield was quiet around her in the way that a house is quiet when it has finally decided to let someone in. She closed the book. She pressed it once against her chest, the way she always did. Then she set it on the windowsill beside the candle, and left it there, its cover facing upward, its pages settled. She did not need to carry it anymore. Thank you for staying with Margaret until the end of her story. If her journey moved you, take a moment to leave a word about the moment that mattered most to you, and know that there are always more stories waiting here whenever you need one. The candle on the windowsill burned low and steady. The watercolor book rested beside it, open now to the lavender page, and the moonlight and the candlelight fell across it together. And Margaret Elwood, the Duchess of Thornfield, sat in the chair her husband's first wife had loved and felt, for the first time since her mother's death, that she was home.